This is Truth and Other Lies, episode 1939, Wagging the Donald.
Mark, do you think that good old President Trump is taming the deep state, or is he the malleable instrument of the United States' legacy of unilateral interventionism? In other words, are these unelected government officials trying to jam him up? How's he doing fending them off? Today is not so much going to be a report card, but just an overview. I think we're getting ready to party like it's 1999, in the words of a great 20th century artist, Prince. Impeachment is upon us, but that's not the topic of today's show, although it easily could be.
Yes, it certainly could, but let's wait until there's more to talk about. Given the last 3 years, the history of shenanigans and tomfoolery, this very well could be another feeble attempt by the Democrats to unseat a president they don't like, and there's also a chance that maybe there's a there.
You know, there could be a there if there was an investigation to tell us. Right now, we don't know much. Mark, way back during the transition period, when President Trump was elected before he took office, we started recording our Genesis podcast. It was called A Brief History of the Deep States of America. And in that, we took a look from World War II up until that moment on how the bureaucracy, corrupt government officials, the intelligence community kind of cabled together to controvert the expectations of the president and the foreign policy that president wants. And we gave several examples. Now, we couldn't really talk about Mr. Trump at the time because he'd yet to take office. Now, nearly 3 years into this, or more than 3 years into this, I believe, there's been some events happen under the current president's watch that are going to allow us to take a fair, earnest look at whether or not he's fighting off the deep state or if he just got swallowed up by it like everybody else.
As we've talked about the press, and people who follow the press know that the press isn't as good as it used to be. And it's not polling very well. By some polls, people trust the press less than they trust Congress. And Congress routinely polls in the teens.
It's such an interesting dynamic how everyone complains about the media and everyone complains about the Congress. But now everyone right now is looking to the media and trusting the information that's coming out. And they're going to look at the Congress to trust them to act on that information, to do some sort of new inquiry into the current president. It's funny how people pick and choose when they want, when their loyalties come into play, I suppose.
We've also talked about the financial struggles that news outlets have, especially traditional news outlets. So on Wednesday, I was curious to see how much Trump is buoying the news industry. MSNBC had the most mentions of Trump on their landing page. Take a guess how many times the word Trump appeared.
600.
Close, 60. 60 times on their front page they said Trump. Guess who was in second place?
Rudy Giuliani.
Very good. Close again. Fox News, 46 times.
There's those who believe that the traditional media, so-called, mainstream media, is out to bury the president. But I don't think I could totally believe that, because without him, they wouldn't have any ratings at all. I mean, could you imagine President Pence? If President Pence was president, no one would even watch.
What are you going to talk about? It reminds me of that line at the end of the first Willy Wonka film. Remember what happened to the boy who got everything he wanted.
like President Pence, what's your comment on anything? I don't know.
Pence, you haven't tweeted anything. What's a Twitter?
God shut down my Twitter account. I'm just kidding. Don't send me emails saying that I'm anti-religion. It was a joke.
All right, let's take a break and come back with Wagging the Donald. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it is a great idea. Call or text 830 Jacobin anytime. If we like what you have to say, we'll discuss your comments on the air. If we don't like what you have to say, you'll hear about that too. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it should be.
Welcome back into Truth and Other Lies. I'm James Jacobin, as always, along with my older brother Mark. We're the internet's only live bi-coastal radio program, or at least so says me. So, Mark, today's going to be a little bit different of a show. We are going to give a fair overview of a few events that have transpired overseas under the administration of Donald J. Trump. And then you are going to decide whether or not he's deep state or not. And we're going to start over there, obviously in the Middle East, and take a look at this first event that was relatively early on in the Trump administration. The first airstrike in Syria, known as the Syria airstrike. I forget the date.
It was in April of 2017.
Just about 60 days after the president takes office, he found cause to bomb a Syrian airfield where Russian planes were on the runway. There's some people who looked at that as him being naive, or there's others who looked at it as that's a retaliation for Syria's President Assad chemically warfaring some children or something of that nature. To this day, we're not clear on any of it. Why don't you take us through what happened there?
What happened is that Syria has been accused of stockpiling chemical weapons. Now, there has been a lot of rumors in the past, especially during the Saddam Hussein regime, that Iraq and Syria were buddy-buddy with their chemical weapons programs. Where a country like Syria is going to get 1,000 tons of chemical weapons that they're reported to have, I don't know. But that's what the so-called experts tell us. And in 2012, the Syrians actually admitted to having some chemical weapons. So it's not a big reach to say, well, they must have gotten them from his buddy Saddam.
Right, because the operating theory towards the end of 2003 was that Saddam, being a member of the Ba'ath Party, and there being a big Ba'ath Party contingency in Syria, that he moved the weapons there. But that's kind of neither here nor there for this point.
Right. No,
we don't know.
The Syrians are accused of being their own production facility. They have been accused of operating upwards of 50 chemical weapon facilities.
Yeah, and how does this guy stay off the United Nations radar, this Assad character? So Trump blows up the airfield. And what was the public reaction at the time?
The same reaction that every new president gets when he blows something up. Applause. That's the American standard. New president blows something up. Yay, strong president.
Yeah, and the question we're asking with this event is this unelected government officials, did they unduly influence the president? He was a new president at the time. He'd yet to show his acumen for foreign policy one way or another. So he obviously listened to his advisors. There was also rumors underground that the Israelis fed him the intelligence, making it kind of look like that he was a pawn of the Israelis, but that was never actually proven. We did a whole show on whether or not that was true or not. We couldn't get to the bottom of it, obviously, because we don't have access to the intel files. I guess we have to call the CIA for those, or the New York Times.
There is no intelligence when it comes to Syria. All we have is the word of the government and whatever the government tells the news people to tell us. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, has been accused on multiple occasions of using chemical weapons in the civil war against the uprising in Syria, the people that want to depose him violently. We do know that chlorine gas has been used. We do suspect that things like sarin gas have been used. But we don't know who's using them because there is no reliable intelligence coming from Syria. So every time a chemical attack occurs in Syria, because the United States is on the side of the opposition, they seem to automatically blame Assad for the chemical strike. And that's what that airfield was in response to, a chemical attack that did happen in Syria, in Damascus. There's no question about that. But who perpetrated it, that's what's in question.
Yeah, there's even people here in America who said it was a false flag operation, who said it was conducted by Israeli intelligence or the Russians or the Americans just to give the president an excuse to bomb an airfield.
Or who's to say the rebels didn't get their hands on the chemical weapons that are in Syria and use them and set up Assad?
Yeah, there's numerous different scenarios, but being that there was never an investigation and you can't really take at face value what the American media says about these things, because for one, they probably don't know.
Based on very thin intelligence, we launched 59 Tomahawk missiles actually, at a cost of $1.5 million apiece for a total of $88 million to destroy a couple of airplanes sitting on a runway.
And the message we're sending to President Assad over there in Syria is we wag our finger and say, we're wagging the Donald here and say, okay, don't kill children with chemical weapons. Now, the counter argument to that is what on earth would be the motivation of President Assad in April of 2017 to blitz his own people when the civil war was basically won? He was just mopping up, knowing for a fact that the likely retaliatory strike from the West, specifically America, would be harsh. Why would he do that? This is what makes me lean. Although I don't have any evidence, I can look at the arc of information available and say he wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have rolled the dice, putting his relationship with Russia at jeopardy, sparking a war in the Middle East, with America and Russia starting bombing airfields. I'm going to put this up under the category here that then new President Trump got deep stated. I think he panicked, and I think he was in a hurry to show that he would be a strong military president.
Yes. And special care was taken not to hit any of the Russian facilities that were on the ground because Assad has the full support of Russia. Eventually, he's going to win this civil war because Russia's backing him.
Well, and the other reason President Trump didn't want to bomb the Russian planes is because they just got him elected.
Yes, that's considered poor form, Bobby Kennedy.
Man, we could have so much fun on this program, Mark, if we didn't have any ethics or scruples.
Let's fast forward 12 months to April of 2018, when there is another much larger attack executed against Syria. And this was against 3 suspected chemical weapons facilities. What they're telling us are chemical weapons facilities. We covered this in Jacobin episode 1831 and 1832. There paints a very clear picture that we were acting in cahoots, or at least in tacit support of Israel in taking out these chemical facilities, because in the past we have worked with France and England. Israel has made multiple independent strikes. Israel has made more than 100 strikes in Syria since the beginning of the Syrian civil war.
Don't see that on the news, do you, Mr. Jacobin?
You do not. No, I don't know whose side they're on.
They're on their own side, sir. They're on their own side.
They're on their own side. So when people say it was the Israelis who dropped the chemical weapons, that's not an unreasonable assertion because they're always in Syrian airspace.
Well, and it wouldn't be the first time because Israel cannot outwardly do these kinds of strikes. It would spark a massive war. All the nations over there would invade them at the same time, looking for an excuse. So, for instance, whenever we go bomb Iraq, which I'm sure we'll do again in a few years just to keep it consistent with the calendar, we always tell Israel to hold their powder. Don't fire back if they bomb anything in the occupied territories or lob missiles into Tel Aviv, because we don't want a wider conflict, as it were. But in this case, who does it benefit the most for the president to drop another $100 million worth of bombs on suspected chemical labs after yet another suspected chemical burst from Assad against his own people?
Let's add another dimension to that equation. In 2017, you could say, well, that was a reflex reaction by a new president, by a non-political president who wasn't fully seated in his chair yet. But in April of 2018, Donald Trump appointed a new national security advisor. Do you remember who that might be?
The Walrus, Bolton.
John Bolton, well-known war hawk.
See, I thought you were going to go for Michael Bolton, his cousin, the well-known pop singer from the 1990s. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. In fact, I spend a lot of time knocking that stuff down. But if one of the main chief neocon architects of the miserable failure that was the Iraq War of 2003, the miserable intelligence failure, why in the world would President Trump, claiming to drain the swamp, bring this guy in to be his main advisor in these kind of affairs? And then literally within a week, we're bombing Syria.
The timing was so coincidental that the administration felt the need to come out and say, oh, this is not coincidental.
Bolton showed up with his shelf full of neocon bombing targets and said, hey, this is a good one. Donald Trump, never having before heard of Syria, went with it.
Let's take a break and come back with more Wagging the Donald. This is Philip A. Buster. My friends call me all the time. Jacobin Butters is a listener-supported operation. It is not owned by some giant corporation pushing an elitist agenda. There's no billionaire paying the bills and telling them what to say. Although, I might not complain if there was. Jacobin Brothers speaks for the people and is the people. Show your support by visiting jacobinbutters.com. Click the donate button and throw the boys some scratch. I'll be glad you did. jacobinbutters.com.
Welcome back into Truth and Other Lies, Wagging the Donald. Mark, part of the reason we're doing this show today is to compare the current president, President Donald Trump, a little bit to his predecessors. We recently covered Gulf of Tonkin, the sinking of the Lusitania, the blowing up of the Maine, to find out decades later that the information put out at the time wasn't necessarily true. We've given numerous examples of every president from Lyndon Baines Johnson to John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan with Iran-Contra, Bill Clinton in the mid-1990s, from our point of view, giving in to the bureaucracy and feeding the beast to get reelected, up their ante in the polls, to go bomb people on thin information or be forced into it by the intelligence community to save their political necks. And what we're trying to figure out here in real time, which is a little harder to do, is whether or not Donald J. Trump is resisting the unelected public officials known as the deep state, or is he bought into it part and parcel? Let's wrap up on Syria and keep moving on.
We bombed Syria. We executed 85 total munitions between a combination of Tomahawks and laser-guided bombs, $142 million. It came out based on the number of casualties during that strike. We spent $1.9 million per person to kill those people. And the timing between the hiring of John Bolton and the strike against Syria, again, in response, well, this wasn't even in response to a chemical attack. It was based on intelligence, again. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that intelligence came from Syria. I'm naming not Syria, but Israel. The timing is a little bit too suspicious. Now, given that these things take some planning and some timing, John Bolton may not have been involved, but his presence certainly didn't decelerate any planning that was occurring.
Well, what I would add to that, Mark, is Trump and his people were probably in negotiations with Bolton for a while before they brought him on. And I'm sure the interview process went like this. What would you do? What are your plans here? What are your plans there? So although he'd only been on the job a week, it doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't in on the preparations. They just hadn't announced him as, the new chief war criminal yet.
Oh, so this was a condition of hiring. I'll come work for you if I get to bomb Syria.
Yeah, I'm going to take that back. I don't want to call John Bolton a war criminal. I just think he's a crazy person who should never be in charge of anything, much less, advising the president on who to bomb.
What? Wait. If we're initiating unprovoked attacks on a foreign sovereign, by definition, that's a war criminal. And I have not seen any convincing evidence that this wasn't an unprovoked attack.
Well, what it leads rise to, Mark, is that we can do whatever we want, wherever we want. And this guy, John Bolton, he's such bad news. He's primarily responsible, him and a smaller group of, George W. Bush's neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feld, Donald Rumsfeld, in cahoots with Dick Cheney, to get that agenda driven over there. And to recycle this guy and bring him back after it was clearly proven by any objective measure that his policy in the mid-2000s, led to ruination of an entire country and political divides over here. The miscalculation of President Trump for hiring this guy is maybe one of the single worst things he's done in his presidency, in my opinion.
Let's move on to the Iran tanker saga. In June of this year, there have been several skirmishes in the Gulf of Hormuz, which is claimed by Iran, and it culminated in June with an attack on 2 oil tankers, one flagged under Japan and one flagged under Norway, if memory serves. We, the United States, immediately blamed Iran because the fuzzy pictures that we took from 32,000 miles in space said, oh, yes, those are definitely Iranians dressed in that green camouflage there.
Yeah, wasn't this a case of actual, Jason Bourne type sabotage? This wasn't a missile strike or an attack from a gunboat. The cargo holds blew up from internal sabotage.
Right. This was small boat tactics. Iran raised their hand and said, no, we didn't do this one. Okay, all right. We've done some bad stuff, but this isn't the bad stuff we did this time around.
So the question to be answered here. First of all, Iran is a very unreliable narrator. They're a bunch of butchers. But it doesn't mean they did this. And again, you have to look at what would they gain by blowing up a Japanese cargo ship or a Norwegian cargo ship? Could it be that someone else did it to tempt the president to bomb Iran? Being that they saw how easily, in this case, with Syria, the Syria strikes, of what he did there. There seemed to be a larger game going there because it wasn't just a group of, Antifa vandals that went over there into the Gulf there and blew up those tankers.
And a day later, it was announced that the president was going to launch a retaliatory strike against Iran for them attacking the tankers. Several hours later, it was announced that that strike had been called off. For me, this was an important moment because this was the first time that I saw the president potentially acting on his anti-establishment platform, saying, no, we're not going to follow the playbook from the 1950s that says every time someone passes gas in a country we don't like, we use that as an excuse to launch $100 million worth of munitions on them.
Yeah, I would highly credit the president here. I don't know why he was going to strike Iran to begin with. Obviously, he was fed some intelligence that led him to impulsively announce that he was going to bomb Iran on Twitter. It's always good to give your enemy a heads up when you're going to bomb them.
Like what they say in sports, James. It doesn't matter if they know what play we're making if they can't stop it.
Exactly. Just ask Bill Belichick. I would liken his political backbone here to what John F. Kennedy did in the Bay of Pigs, where he refused to send in air cover, even though he knew it would be politically disastrous for him. And he stood up to the intelligence community. Donald Trump, probably for the first time in his presidency, and to his credit in this area alone, I think he did the right thing. And I think this led to the eventual firing or resignation of Bolton, because you can't just go indiscriminately bomb a country because you think possibly maybe they blew up a cargo ship. To say nothing for the fact that neither Japan nor Norway seem to have a problem with it.
Neither Japan nor Norway called out Iran. There was no formal complaint. No one went to the United Nations in New York City and said, hey, Iran is bombing our tankers. If you were to take this to a civil court, the judge would say the United States has no cause of action in this case.
There's no pretext for a strike. So in this case, it seems like the president from Syria and along the way there had been getting sucked down the rabbit hole of the military-industrial complex to feed the beast, to keep building bombs, to keep bombing stuff indiscriminately. And he said no. And he shut off the spigot.
He said
no. And I don't
no.
think he got enough credit for that.
He got no credit.
He didn't get enough credit for that.
No, he was immediately framed as being weak, as not standing up to the bullies on the block. Yeah. I think regardless of what has happened in his presidency or what will happen, this will stand as the moment when Donald President, I guess that's a good name for him, made good on his campaign promises and said, I'm going to drain the swamp, because he stood up to every establishment figure in Washington and said no.
He said absolutely no. And as of the recording of this show, he is still the president. We'll see how that plays out in the next few weeks. But as of right now, he's the president.
Yes, we might be calling him Donald the Criminal later on.
How bad for the country this whole process is going to be. When we look specifically at that, I think that's a huge event. I think Donald Trump grew up. He grew into his own shoes. He realized that the intelligence community works for him, that the bureaucracy works for him. And he said, no, I'm not going to start a wider, because if we bomb Iran this summer, we don't know what happens next. Do they bomb Israel? Do they start hitting our ships? Does it escalate?
And James, going back to deep states of America, you said a president does not get reelected unless they feed the beast. And we've mentioned multiple times that if you were to look forward and then look backward, if Donald was reelected, we would be able to look back and see an escalation in military activity that would contribute to that. And so what we're seeing now is him saying no, putting up his hand, but that was in June. Then August came along, and then what happened in August?
Is that when they fired Bolton? No, the Saudi Arabia oil field strike.
Yes, I'm sorry. This was in September, the Saudi Arabia oil field strike. Here Trump is saying, okay, based on this flimsy little small boat action, I'm not going to launch $1 million in ordnance. And then a month later, we see an escalation in the game. We see a strike on a country that is on its face hurting nobody, who you don't see in the news associated with violence and conflict outside of the Yemen war, because nobody's reporting on the Yemen war.
Are we talking about Saudi Arabia here?
We're talking about Saudi Arabia.
Okay, minus the murdering of journalists in foreign embassies.
Well, if you were to talk to the Saudis, they would say that was an internal matter.
So someone misread a memo. But yeah, so Saudi Arabia, whose only real known enemy in the region is Iran, and they're fighting that proxy war in Yemen. So now, Mark, Syria Airfield Strike 1, Syria Airfield Strike 2, the weapons labs, the Japanese cargo ship and the Norwegian cargo ship. All these events, Mark, the hand that pulled it off has yet to be revealed, or at least the public doesn't know of them. And so in the first two cases, the president bombs. In the third case, he firmly says no. And right after that, the Saudi oil fields get bombed by a drone, Mark, or multiple drones. And you can't just go down to Walmart and buy a drone to bomb an oil field.
No, or Amazon. I tried. Not that I was going to be bombing an oil field.
I think you should edit that out, Mark, before we get investigated. So this is the second big event that is now being laid at the hands of the Iranian government in the last 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days. And this is a huge thing because this is more or less, if you're bombing another country, whether or not you're bombing a military target or civilian oil field, be that as it may, that's an act of war, which should be met with a declaration of war or some retaliation.
In the words of General Curtis LeMay, there is no distinction between military and civilian targets.
Well, Mr. LeMay, may he rest in peace. None of us to this day know what exactly happened there. Our media more or less is laying this at the feet of the Iranians and calling the president weak for not taking action. Now, this is the same media who, just 10 years ago was calling George Bush a warmonger for taking action in the Middle East. So it seems this complex delta of media and intelligence sources really, 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 really want the president to bomb Iran. This seems where this is going because they're the big player in the Middle East. They're the one allegedly causing all the problems. But one, they're denying it. And two, if they are doing it, they're doing it so covertly it can't be tied back to them.
And they're doing it with very high technology, something that we haven't previously seen from Iran. There's something else that factors into this. A year ago, a month after Donald Trump hired John Bolton to be his national security advisor, and less than a month after they bombed some planes on an airfield, the United States declared that Iran was in violation of the agreement that was signed by President Obama in 2015. Unilaterally, no other country accused Iran of violating the agreement. The United States did and said, "You're out." We, in a very plain sense, are guilty of provoking Iran because, by all accounts, they were following the terms of the agreement. They were not enriching uranium beyond what they were supposed to. They were not creating more enriched uranium than they were supposed to. And when we terminated the agreement, Iran said, okay, well, you know what? We're going to make as much as we want to.
Yeah, all bets are off. Keeping with Mr. Bolton, and I cannot wait for the books to come out on this guy. He'll probably write his own book, and of course, he'll be the hero. Obviously, Bolton was pressuring National Security Advisor Bolton, or whatever his job title was. I forget what it was. Warmonger in chief, the Walrus, had to be pressuring Trump to retaliate against Iran because he fired Bolton right around the same time.
Right.
So that tells me that he stopped listening to Bolton and he realized that Bolton was the problem. So although there hasn't been any action that we know of overtly, maybe covertly there has been, by this administration, by this president, you would have to say, again, for the second time in just a few months, the president has shown great restraint because he didn't have enough information to start an incident and or a war in the Middle East.
And there are very few people that would argue with the statement, the president doesn't have enough information.
That's correct. And so this kind of goes contrary. His reputation and image right now is being very impulsive. It seems like he's taken a very measured approach to this situation. If you compare that to his immediate predecessor, Mr. Obama drone striked a lot of people with a lot less information. And obviously you hit the targets and you get the bad people, I suppose, but you kill a lot of innocent people. And in this case, being that Iran is a formative force in the Middle East, I thought it was a great show of measured temperament and presidential skill to, as of this recording, to not go bomb Iran with insufficient evidence.
Let's go to the chat line. Our friend Jim has chimed in. He says he's from the government and he's here to help.
Let's put him on.
He also says that Israel has a right to exist and that he's impressed with the actions of the president, and he's impressed with the president's support of Israel versus his predecessors. James, I don't think you or I have suggested that Israel doesn't have a right to its sovereignty, but very few countries get away with preemptive strikes against their neighbors by saying, well, he looked at me funny and I was afraid he was going to attack me, so I attacked him first. The Bernie Goetz defense doesn't work very well on the international stage.
Well, the problem with Israel, of course they have a right to exist. Every country has a right to exist. Is the question we're asking here today is it'd be much easier if Israel just came out and said, yeah, we're behind some of this stuff, or yeah, we provided the intelligence, or yeah, we have a dog in this fight. Instead, if they are involved feeding us intelligence to try us to do their bidding, this causes us enormous problems. To me, it doesn't really have much to do with their right to exist. It has to do with the public information that we're getting. Like, if we're going to respond and bomb someone, we should be bombing them for American interests. Now, if our president comes out and says it's within our interest to defend Israel, then that's one thing. But we're not getting any of that.
That's true. Our interest is a very fuzzy term, because I have to tell you, in the last 40 years, I haven't seen bombing anybody as being in my interest. But I've seen a lot of defense contractors and corporations. It's been in their interest.
Yeah. Well, and to answer Jim's question more directly, of course, if you set Iran next to Israel, right? Israel is the only democratic society in the Middle East. They're the only capitalist structure. They're the only ones that have elections. They're the only people that don't go around blowing people up in coffee shops to try and get their political points across. If you put them up against Iran, Iran is pure dictatorially evil. And I hope one day that regime goes.
Let's take a break and come back with the conclusion of Wagging the Donald.
Find your favorite Jacobin Brothers merchandise at shop.jacobinbrothers.com. T-shirts, hats, and beverage conveyances all branded with your favorite Jacobin Brothers logo. You'll be shocked by how much smarter you sound debating your friends while wearing official Jacobin Brothers apparel. Shop.jacobinbrothers.com.
Welcome back in The Truth in Our Lives. Today's episode, Wagging the Donald. First, we want to thank Jim for texting in that comment. Hopefully, we sufficiently answered your question. Before we move on to what our overall thoughts here on how the deep state, if at all, is affecting this president, it's worth putting a bow on the oil field strike. You have to look at motivation. There's a lot of people that would say Iran has a lot of motivation to bomb the oil field. And then there's a lot of people who would say, well, no, America just did that as a false flag, as an excuse to go bomb Iran. Either way, we still don't know what happened there. There's got to be someone who knows. British intelligence, the Israeli intelligence, the Iranian intelligence. If Iran didn't do this, now they've denied doing this, right? What's the next step with that part of it?
I'll tell you another reason why it doesn't make sense. Iran is an Islamic republic, and that means that the church is in charge, not the state. Last 20 years, Iran has made a big deal of talking about its presidents, President Rouhani, President Ahmadinejad. But the president is not the supreme ruler. It's the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Ayatollah Khomeini has been in charge since the revolution of 78?
79.
79, thank you. How many Middle Eastern dictators has he outlived from U.S. intervention?
Well, all of them.
All of them.
Because all of them.
He is not an impulsive individual. If there is a mad genius running a country in the world, the Ayatollah Khomeini is at the top of the list. Gaddafi's gone. Saddam Hussein is gone. Assad is on his way out. He knows how to rattle sabers. He knows how to poke the bear, but he's very good at poking the bear and running away. If the Iranians really are behind this, it's very much a cause of concern for one of two reasons. One, it means Khomeini is losing his marbles. Or two, and this is worse, Khomeini is losing control. And if Khomeini is losing control to the hardliners, that's bad news for everybody.
Well, that's really bad news. This would have shades of Imperial Japan in the 1930s, where the military or the intelligence services start to have the ear of the public or the bureaucracy. And this one, we're going to have to wait and play out, Mark. The point of all this is for us to take a look a few years into the presidency of Donald Trump, or as you say, Donald President, that how's he doing at holding off the deep state? How's he navigating this snake pit of information and then making decisions based upon it? And I would say he's probably doing pretty good. The simple not bombing of Iran twice now would set him apart from his predecessor. The firing of Michael Bolton, who wanted him to bomb Iran, would also set him up. Not Michael Bolton, but John Bolton would also set him apart. It would put him up in the high masterclass standard of John Kennedy, who fired the head of the CIA and numerous other people after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And the question now becomes, will Mr. Trump face a backlash within his own government, his own intelligence community, to try and screw him up because he won't play ball? That's the ultimate question.
I'd say right now it's an even Steven playing field, in that the deep state has won a couple of rounds. Trump has won a couple of rounds. But there's an X factor here. And the X factor is the president himself. Did the president resist bombing Iran? Did he resist retaliating against Iran for both the attacks on the tankers and the attack on the Saudi oil field? Because A, he's playing his playbook the way he wants to play it, or B, because he's an impulsive, obstinate individual who will simply do the opposite of what people tell him to do.
I don't think in this particular case he's just doing the opposite of what people tell him to do. I think he has a good handle on it. And I think he's made numerous large decisions that prove that. Also, he's improved. The same way John Kennedy improved, the same way Ronald Reagan improved, certainly the same way William Jefferson Clinton improved. Because when you walk into office, your intelligence services and your military structure is going to come to you with all these threats and say, okay, this has to be done, this has to be done, that has to be done. So at the beginning, you're just a little unsure. And then the measure there is over a period of time, do you find your footing? And in this particular area, I think the president is finding his footing. As far as whether or not he's going to crumble down because of this, is, according to the New York Times, the whistleblower that lit the fuse earlier this week on this whole new impeachment thing is a CIA officer. Is an actual CIA officer, and no one has disputed that one way or another. The New York Times seems to have nailed that down. Is this just one CIA officer who legitimately thought the president oversteps his bounds with that phone call? Or is this the CIA sending Donald Trump a message? Hey, we want you to do what we want you to do, or we're going to get rid of you. I think there's a lot of people out here right now, when you see the word CIA behind the whistleblower, this could be looked at as direct retaliation from the unelected government bureaucrats.
I would much prefer that the whistleblower was an operator from the White House, because that means this was a person who is operating within the boundaries of their job and said, I heard something that I think is valuable public information and it needs to be released. If the CIA is getting involved in the president's personal conversations, now this phone call was not made from the Oval Office, it was made from the residence.
Which the president is entitled to do. It's not official business, technically, if it's made from the residence. A lot of people don't know that.
Right. It's not official business. And now because he's the president and because he's a presidential candidate, there's always a gray line there as far as, is he acting in an official capacity? Is he acting as a candidate? Is he securing opposition research against the other candidates? The president is allowed to use Air Force One to campaign as long as his campaign reimburses the Air Force for use of the jet. If he's making campaign calls from the residence, if he's reimbursing the U.S. for the cost of those calls, then he's within his rights. He may have done something wrong. He may not have. I don't know. Nobody knows yet. But the fact that the CIA, which is supposed to be operating outside the bounds of the United States, is spying on the president should be a cause for concern for the Republic, for the principles of the Republic, and for any future president.
Oh, I totally agree. Why is the CIA involved in this at all? Did the guy happen to be walking by the residence? Is the CIA taping, eavesdropping on the president? I mean, how did this happen? What chain of events? And I think the public deserves an investigation, and let the investigation go where it goes. We will know whether or not this president has given in to the whims of what you and I coined the deep state well before it got hijacked by the news. Is this: what does the president do next? A lot of presidents get reelected, or when they find themselves in trouble or being impeached, like Clinton, they start bombing things. So if the president starts bombing things, we'll know that he's given in.
And then if he starts bombing things, it will just go away, won't it?
Well, it worked for William Jefferson Clinton, I suppose.
Now here's another problem I see. If the president's personal phone calls are fair game, if anything the president says on the personal line is subject to scrutiny by the entirety of the country, shouldn't we go back and look at all of the telephone calls by all of the presidents in the modern era to see what improprieties or presumed improprieties they might have been up to?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to happen. But I imagine you'd find a lot there with a lot of things.
There's no statute of limitations on capital offenses. We could have 5 presidents in jail right now if we went back and listened to their phone calls.
Well, and the damage here, Mark, irregardless of what happens with the Nancy Pelosi impeachment inquiry, is this: the office of the presidency once again is damaged. I have 2 questions. 1, who the hell would want to be president? And 2, if we continue down this road, every time we get a new president, the guy's going to be impeached. The man or woman, is going to be impeached. You think if Elizabeth Warren becomes president and the Republicans hold the Senate, they're not going to immediately try and castigate her? Of course they are. And who suffers? The American people. I think that any president elected deserves the right to govern and do the job they were elected to do. And if it is indeed the case that the CIA went and jacked up Donald Trump because he wouldn't play ball, this is far worse than anything he could have done by talking a little smack about Joe Biden to the Ukrainian prime minister. I mean, give me a break. Whether you like Trump or not, I would invite everyone to recognize the danger of allowing this to happen.
I have always said, or I've said for a number of years anyway,
that anyone who wants to be president is not psychologically fit to be president. That's the quandary we're in this country.
Well, Mark, I think you finally said something that a lot of people can agree on. Well, Mark, this episode, Wagging the Donald, if you want further context to this, go to jacobinbrothers.com, create a free account, and go all the way back to our very first podcast, A Brief History of the Deep States of America. We're going to continue to update you on this situation, and we're going to continue to take a look at the president's activities as it relates to his own intelligence community and overseas oil field strikes. On behalf of my brother Mark, I am James. We are the Jacobin Brothers, and you have been listening to Truth and Other Lies.